Is it Jen?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Jen, thank you so much for making the time. We'll give it a minute, see if any other people stumble in, but my intent is to start promptly to respect everyone's time.
Oh, there's plenty of people that will turn up late, I'm sure you'll find.
Good morning, afternoon, Joyce. Thank you for attending. Oh, good morning, good afternoon, Lisa. Thank you for joining.
Hey.
We'll give it a minute, but we are going to start pretty promptly. So I'll give one more minute for anyone else to roll in. But I want to respect everyone's time. We have a lot to chat about today, so I'm very excited to dive in. And also just some business, right? So if everyone's not aware, this meeting is being recorded. My intention is to share it, with the Limicon community. So just be aware of that. If for whatever reason you do not want something recorded, maybe we get into a discussion after the fact, just let me know. I can certainly edit it after the fact if we want to dive deep and you feel more comfortable with that. But the core presentation, that 45 minutes that I'll be chatting for, is going to be recorded.
Mm-hmm.
Oh.
Tucker, welcome. Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you for coming. No stress, Joyce. Naima, good morning, good afternoon. Thank you for joining.
Hello.
All right, I think this is a perfect starting time to respect everyone's time. We are going to dive in. Let me just get everything set up. Just a quick housekeeping for those who just joined in. Just so you're aware, the meeting is being recorded. Mari, welcome. The meeting is being recorded. I'm going to record the 45-minute presentation. There will be, so we'll talk for like 45 minutes, high level. I have a lot to cover, but hopefully no stress, Tucker, thank you. But hopefully it'll be resonant. I'll leave some space for Q&A. We have an hour scheduled. I'm going to be happy to stay after the fact if there is interest. And if for whatever reason in the Q&A we feel that you want to dive deep into a topic that you don't feel comfortable being recorded, just let me know and we can pause the recording, okay? But for the core presentation, I am going to record. And on that note, I think it's a perfect time to dive in. So I'm just going to move this over. And well, again, welcome everyone, and thank you so much for taking time out of your day to join me. I am humbled and appreciative of the opportunity to chat with you about temporal naturalism today. Just a brief about me. So I have a pretty eclectic history. I've been a founder with an exit. I've done about a decade in nonprofit social impact work. Presently, I am professionally working on building public goods in Austin, Texas, leveraging AI for affordable housing infrastructure. So I'm also the author of a book called Self-Actualization in the Age of Crisis. Good morning, Justine. And a co-founding member and present executive director of SpiritDAO. So before we dive in, I just want to kind of provide some context, right? I think a lot of us are here at Limicon because we understand and we feel the deep need and kind of sense for transformation. And ultimately, I would make the argument, as I'll kind of present today, that our biggest challenge is not that we are here, but that we've lacked viable alternatives. And what I'm going to present to you today with temporal naturalism is a framework of an alternative, one that can evolve alongside its practitioners. This is really part one of a discussion. And part two is going to be next week at the same time, where I'll talk about SpiritDAO, which is how we're kind of actionizing this philosophy and this orientation. But today is going to be kind of a high-level dive into the philosophy. Moving on to this, before I dive into temporal naturalism, I just want to talk briefly. This is not just my effort. This is an effort that has been going on. I've been personally working on this direction for about 9 years, but there are several academic contributors. Roberto Mangia-Berra-Unger being the one of the core ones. He's a Roscoe Pound scholar at Harvard. He's written at this point like 12 books, but really has kind of deeply thought about and put a tremendous effort into the construction of a spiritual alternative. Lee Smolin is a physicist. He is really well known for his work on time and the reorienting the cosmology and physics community around a universe that is in fact perpetually dynamic and the lack of any sort of static infrastructure. So he's written several books that's kind of informed this talk. I have personally published Self-Actualization in the Age of Crisis, published it about 3 years ago. And also that colorful one is a graphic novel called Becoming More. It's been published, but it was kind of like a beta version that's been in only like a select distribution, and we're looking to kind of move it forward to a greater publication in the future. Top right corner, a little personal. I was in Cambridge in December to meet with Professor Unger and had a deep dive into temporal naturalism and SpiritDAO and our shared efforts. So I'm really excited to kind of just be continuing this lineage of a real alternative. And so today we're going to be discussing temporal naturalism, right? Which I would argue is a shared direction towards binding spirit and structure. Now, before we dive in to what it is, I just want to kind of set some context for why a new form of spirituality, why a new religion. And let's first start by defining spirituality for the context of our conversation, because many people have many different definitions. I would define it as the relationship between a gentle observing experience and the world around us. So it's that relationship. And what makes spirituality different than everything else is that it's the thing that deals with all things. And that relationship is paramount to our individual orientation in the world, how we view the world, how we imagine, etc. And we can say that all of us have kind of inherited through one direction or through direct influence or indirect specific religious orientations or their influence. And all religions attempt to address three core aspects of our human condition, right? And they do it in different ways, which we'll do an analysis towards the end. But the core primary purpose of spirituality and religion is to address groundlessness, right? Which is doubt, right? What we do is never enough. Insatiability, our desires. We get the thing, and 2 weeks later, the thing is dull, and we want the next shiny thing. And of course, death, right? And I would make the argument that death is at the root of all metaphysics. And all of our inherited spiritual narratives attempt to address these things. And I think some do it better in certain directions than others. But ultimately, the need for spiritual renaissance, a kind of reimagining of hearing spirituality, is foundational in decoupling our capacity to transform the world from crisis. And I would say historically, in the human history, much of our greatest changes has been relying on crisis. So how do we raise that temperature of transformation, of experimentation, without crisis as a relying component, and ultimately kind of free the latent imagination that's trapped in the world? I would make the argument today that, well, how about this? Temporal naturalism focuses on prioritizing a form of humanity where birth lottery is not the most important event in our life. And I would make the argument statistically today, where we are born and who we are born to is the most important event in any individual's life in terms of their trajectory and their access and agency through life. So how do we prioritize a form of being human where that is not true, it's not accurate? And ultimately, it is about taking back the power that we have given our creations over us. So how do we frame spirituality in such a way where we're not beholden to or enslaved to our own imagination, our own creation, a way that allows us to kind of most fully express ourselves? Now, I'll dive into, before we dive into some of the specifics, I want to, oops. Okay, one sec. There you go. And I just want to talk about some core principles of temporal naturalism before we move on. So first these are kind of the grounding principles. So temporal naturalism, just to break that down, temporal being time-based, and naturalism being a naturalistic philosophy of the world. So one of the things we do in temporal naturalism is we recognize the nature of reality as it is. And so the most important feature about the world is that it is what it is, and rather than something else, right? So we inherit this world, and here it is, but it's not arranged to meet our desires or concerns, right? The universe is ambivalent to the individual, to each of us, and what's real is often alien. It's often very different, and we have a strong desire to kind of represent it arranged for our advantage. We want to kind of say, oh well, it must be this way, but ultimately that desire is like the beginning of illusion. So we have to ask ourselves in the framework of a naturalistic spiritual alternative of how do we dismiss the illusions and align ourselves with nature, with divinity as it is. I think in many ways the naturalism implies, but just to be clear, it implies an absence of metaphysics, right? So metaphysics in general wants to show why the world must be the way it is. But the reality of nature, as we observe it, is that the world is surprising, right? It doesn't conform to any model. When I say the world, we can say universe, it's interchangeable. But there is no specific model. And there doesn't have to be a why the world is the way it is. The way we understand anything in the world is by understanding what it could become. And I don't mean that in the sense of its ultimate, reality, but rather what is the next stage of transformation it may undertake. Bless you. If you guys could just mute yourself, if you guys don't mind. And so the other component of temporal naturalism is the inclusive reality of time and changing causality. So we're going to define time as the universe's capacity for change. Another way of thinking about it is the transformation of transformation. But basically, all observations of the universe today tell us that nothing is immune from change, including the laws of nature, including causal relationships. But I want to make it explicitly clear, in terms of cosmology and physics, nothing about the history of the universe has ever not been changing. Since the inception of the universe, transformation has been the default. And a lot of times we confuse our tools, our creations, and we give them we naturalize them. So like math is one of the best examples. Logic is another example. Mathematics is a phenomenal tool, right? It shows us causal relationships. But math takes the perspective of like a godhead. So we observe this thing and we observe it from a timeless perspective. And mathematics either does prediction or measurement. But that's not reality itself, right? Reality is this constant transformation. And this is evidence, for example, that there's no mathematical formula to calculate now, right? It only ever does future or past. So it's, again, about how do we align ourselves with nature as we actually observe it, as opposed to how we may want to observe it. Another core component of temporal naturalism is the emergence of the new, right? So our freedom, our imagination, our power to transform our circumstances in our daily lives is always bound to the emergence of the new. And novelty, right? That is that emergence repeatedly emerges through our observations, through cosmic history, through natural history, through our own human history. And this is a very clear pointing in the direction that it rejects any sort of deterministic, as in predetermined, or static models of the universe. Again, our observations of nature directly stand in counter or against the idea of any sort of predeterministic vision of the world. And causal connections, right? And causal connections can be both random, they can be intentful, causality, right? The idea every reaction has an action has a reaction, but they allow us to kind of, our embrace of causal connections is real, allows us to kind of lay the foundation for new emergence. So to kind of build on that a little bit, anytime the world transforms in any direction, new possibilities for transformation arise that were not there previously. And we have to understand with causality, especially like in the state of a physical world, like the quantum universe, this emergent now, history predates structure, right? So history precedes structure. That is to say that the us arriving in this moment here now has a history, and that history matters. And that's an important component because it's an important aspect of how we orient ourselves in the world and how we structure the world. Another kind of couple quick points around temporal naturalism before we dive into some of the specifics is there's no, right, we agree with Spinoza in the concept that there's no kingdom within a kingdom. A lot of the metaphysics attempt to position humanity as something outside of nature. We are outside of it. We represent something special. We are an exception of nature, but we reject that, right? Humanity is just one link in a continuous spectrum of existence, and a continuous spectrum of transformation. We're a part of it, and a very special part of it, but not unique and not exceptional. And any idea about like predeterminism or like deep structure, it forces us to kind of embrace an illusion, right? This claim to like to be this mysterious exception, and it separates us from nature, right? It says, oh, the more real something is, the more timeless it is. Except, all observations of nature point to the opposite. Nothing becomes less real through its transformation. We also want to, with temporal naturalism, avoid the pitfalls of worshiping reality or believing it's moving towards some sort of like predetermined or perfect end, right? The idea that, oh, this is a play coming out, it's all a play, and we're going to end, and it's going to be this absolute unified whole. And the idea that there's like an ultimate end, it positions us again in this idea where like the less time-bound things are, the more real they are. So this is the illusion, but eventually we'll reach this harmonized whole. This is ultimately, it denies all observations of the world. It's a form of self-deception, and ultimately I would make the argument it's a form of power worship, and we disguise it under this guise of like piety, where we say, oh, we want it to be this way so bad, so we kind of create a metaphysics to support it, and we guise it under this religious orientation. But in reality, it's just a desire to kind of shape the world. Mark, thank you for that comment. I'm gonna, during the Q&A, I'm gonna kind of revisit this, but if you guys don't mind, I do get excited about this stuff, so I'm gonna keep my momentum and until we get there. But this is just some kind of core foundations of temporal naturalism and a naturalistic theory kind of grounded in the universe as it is. So let's move on. This is kind of our brief agenda. We're going to talk about the universe having a story. So in Self-Actualization, the Age of Crisis, I made the argument for to kind of ground this temporal naturalism in cosmology and physics in our history of the universe. So this graph you may have seen before, like this idea of you have future light cones, right? The future is unknown, the past is inaccessible. We have this hypersurface of the present. Here we are. I did draw these little squigglies because one thing that I didn't like about this specific graph is it showed the hypersurface of the present to be sort of static, but that's not at all the case. And unfortunately, I was extremely disappointed in AI imagery. I tried to create it last night, but I was unable to create a new image. So MS Paint did the job, and you see these little squigglies to represent the perpetual change that we inhabit. But this is the nature of the reality as we understand it. And what we see here, this is a graph of our present universe. So temporal naturalism embraces the idea that there is one universe at a time. So this is not multiverse theory. There's one universe at a time. Here we are. But that there are in fact sequential universes. So earlier I shared that nothing about the history of the universe has ever not been changing. And I think this is for some of you, this might be common knowledge. But as recently as 5 years ago, this wasn't deeply accepted as it is today, where we have, for example, this initial moment all the way on the left side, this little flashpoint, that quantum fluctuations. This represents the very initial moments of the universe, and that kind of white phasey part immediately after we call it the Planck epoch. So the Planck epoch is the moment in our universal history. We presently measure it in picoseconds, which is our smallest human form of measurement. But the universe, the physical material universe, existed as a superheated whole. So the laws of nature as we understand them today, and especially like the static laws of nature, for example, things like gravity and strong and weak nuclear forces, we've built a lot of human science and history upon the idea that these things were static. But we now understand that that is not the case. They were not the same during the Planck epoch. And what happened is, as the universe cooled and matter separated, the laws of nature as they presently exist began to evolve. But what is vital about this is to understand that there is nothing about our observation about the universe to date that has not changed over time. So again, it's this perpetual transformation of nature. And this is, so when we think about, in the book, I talked briefly about the idea, this is the cosmic microwave background. So what we're looking at is a radiation map of the universe from our perspective on Earth. And you'll notice in the bottom right-hand corner, there's a little white circle. There's been two teams of physicists. One of them was advised by Roger Penrose. The other is a Russian team. But they have observed radiation in the cosmic microwave background that is older than our universe. Now, for that to be accurate and then confirmed, right, by two different teams, one of two things has to be true. Either that our dating of the universe is incorrect, which is possible, or given the consensus around that, it is likely that there's in fact, again, something before our universe. If there's radiation that extends beyond our universe, there was likely something before our universe to leave that radiation there. So it's the idea of sequential universes. One universe at a time, but before our universe, there was one prior. After our universe, there will be another one. In fact, Lee Smolin in the book, the Singular Universe and the Reality of Time, argues that it's possible that these universes kind of have traits of previous universes, almost like you could imagine a child coming out of a parent, right, a mother. So the idea is we recognize reality as it is, which is an infinite material reality, this perpetual transformation as the default. And I think a lot of times when we think about naturalistic spiritual philosophy, that you kind of get into the critique of it's reductionist. But that argument, the reductionist argument, holds no water anymore, because the physical material of nature, the material nature of reality is infinite. It's perpetual transformation. So it blurs the line between metaphysics and nature. But what it says is, oh, nature provides us a context for the infinite without the need for supernaturality, for kind of the creation of a metaphysic to kind of govern us. So I want to move into how does this, so okay, if the material nature of reality is in fact infinite, what does that mean for the individual, for our spirituality? Well, I'll get into, I'm going to make a comment and I'll dive deeper into it later in the talk, but a lot of our historical options for spirituality they struggle with divinity because, for example, in the monotheistic religions, it posits divinity as accessible to us only after death, right? Divinity is found in heaven. So we can't actually ever know it in life. Now, temporal naturalism rejects that, because if the material nature of reality is in fact infinite, then you and I are both within it and of it, right? We are within it because each of us is a unique set of conscious coordinates. We occupy a space that no one else can occupy. But at the same time, this is a single happening, right? And all of these eyeballs together today are kind of experiencing this moment as a single happening. So there's no separate events in nature. And that's a key component of that. So when we think about the nature of reality, we find ourselves observing two observable infinities. And the observable infinities are the universe itself and human imagination. And the alignment of these two within a specific moment represents our capacity to access divinity in the moment, right? It is when we are most alive, when we become most godlike, when we can align our imagination. So let's tease that apart a little bit. When I say infinite, the struggle with imagination and the universe is that they can only be defined by themselves. And moreover, imagination, just like our physical sciences, cannot be localized. So what I mean by that is when we observe in cosmology, when we look outside the universe and we observe things, we cannot, and no longer, it used to be, but is no longer the kind of popular trend in cosmology and physics, is to localize our observations. That means if we observe something behaving in a certain way in the universe from Earth, it doesn't mean that we can apply that to the entire universe. Just as my imagination, I could define my approach to imagination to you, but it wouldn't apply to your imagination, right? They're both recursive in that they're infinite, and they're both can only be defined by themselves. At the same time, we recognize that human beings are most godlike, most powerful when they're in that kind of flow state of aligning their imagination, their creativity in a moment to bring about novelty, to bring about the new in the directions of their choosing. Now, earlier I mentioned, right, that we live today, we inherit a world where most of the latent imagination is trapped. It's trapped under these systems of our own making. And so the question, the spiritual question that becomes is, well, how do we empower the greatest amount of people to align the observable affinities, to dive deep into their experimentalist impulse and kind of free that aspect of their humanity into the world? Now, when we think about when we think about the self in this context, we have to redefine self, because in a relational universe governed by time and change, we recognize that our capacity to act as agents is perpetually bound to the circumstances we inherit, right? This kind of goes back to that birth lottery component. So we recognize that the self is most accurately defined as the relationship between an individual and their circumstances within a given moment. And from there, we break down the idea of self-actualization to more accurately represent individual actualization, which is the development of I, and systemic actualization, which is the development of we. So self-actualization becomes the combination of these two. And again, this is at its root, the spiritual project is recognizing human divinity in the moment, recognizing the need to most fully empower others to embrace this and kind of leverage this, and do it in such a way that empowers them to do it. In the book, I make the argument that change is the single truth. It was intentionally provocative, and it was argued in the concept of our objective experience that transformation change it supersedes our objective and subjective experiences as individuals in the world. It's not intended to be dogmatic because it applies to itself, right? Change changes. In the book, I write a chapter called The Changing Nature of Time. And we talk about how not only can we see time, for example, if any of you guys have been following modern astronomy and the James Webb telescope, we're finding that the universe itself is extremely similar organization-wise to the human brain. So for example, computationally, the universe has more in common with the human brain than it does any individual galaxy. And actually the flip is true too. The human brain has more in common with the universe than it does any individual neuron. But the two are organized similarly, where there is essentially webs and then there's space. And what it's presently predicted or hypothesized is in that blank space, time dilates differently. So time actually moves differently during that in that space. So the other component of temporal naturalism is the idea of a relational universe. And this is the core philosophy has been presented in metaphysics in the past. We recognize that this is what our present knowledge is telling us. Everything exists in a perpetual state of transformation. There are no separate events in nature. So we've kind of dove into this to some extent already, but we want to kind of develop and kind of dig into this to recognize that divinity of the other. Because I think in many ways, when we think about the historical spiritual narratives, these are tribal religions, and they were designed for otherness. And I'll get deeper into that in a bit. Temporal naturalism seeks to most fully power the individual, empower them to recognize the divinity of the other and orient themselves around that. Now, in the book, I talk a lot about individual actualization, and we spend a lot of time focusing on how do we transform the world from a framework of competition and self-assertion as the primary means of transforming the world, to kind of deeper root ourselves in cooperation. And we also talk about methods to do that. We talk about soulcraft, like routine, discipline, and mastery, and a variety of other things. I'm going to primarily focus on the core values component. Now, one thing about temporal naturalism and is that we consider it not a non-religion religion. So the idea behind it is that it's intended to evolve alongside its community of practitioners. One of the biggest challenges with historical religions and their failure to kind of meet the needs of the moment is that what they attempt to do is they attempt to reinforce the past onto the present. Temporal naturalism seeks to break that. We don't want to reinforce the past up to the present. What we want to do is maximize our agency within the present to transform it. So these core values, to be a temporal naturalist, for example, is not to say that you must embrace these. This is a beginning framework. But if it's not, I don't think I've already mentioned it. A couple of years ago, I donated Self-Actualization in the Age of Crisis. So the book, SpiritDAO owns the book. The church owns the book. I don't own it. So like all the money from the book goes to the DAO. The idea is it's supposed to evolve. But I'm going to go over these core values in a kind of very high level framework. The acronym for remembering them is pretty straightforward. It's reframe courage. So relation is the belief and practice of recognizing our being rooted in a relational universe, recognizing that you equally possess the divinity of imagination and that power as I do. You are equally a transformative agent, and you are at the same time separate, but at the same time identical to me. You are me in a different framework, that this kind of eventual transformation. Equity represents the belief and practice in fairness in both our personal and systemic relationships. Okay, so that's a core one, is that systemic relationships. We inherit a world where the systems governing our lives have been constructed to favor specific groups over others, right? So they favor specific, I'll dive more into this in systemic actualization for some examples, but we want to ensure is as we're creating the new that we're not either inadvertently or intentionally oppressing one group to build up another. Flexibility is the belief and practice of reducing our projection of expectations onto the moment, right? And this is for any of us who are familiar with Eastern religions and the idea of desire being the root of suffering. Most of the time our frustration comes to the fact that we inherit a moment. It is not at all what we wanted it to be, and that frustrates us, right? So, but in reality, the individual who embraces flexibility inherits that moment, observes it for what it is, and then if it doesn't align with their ideal, begins the process of transformation towards the ideal, and how we do that. Restraint is the belief and practice in disciplined choice, both in our relationships with ourselves and with others. So very similar to equity in terms of how we operate in the world and how we create and how we seek to transform, but recognizing that there are, and I think we see this like sickness all over the place, but especially with like the billionaire class in present examples of these people who are just completely off the rails and so obsessed with their own desires that they're willing to kind of throw anything and anything else, anyone under the bus who doesn't kind of agree with them. So it's that element of restraint and recognizing that we are just an aspect of this and not the totality. Awareness is our belief and practice of our power to bring awareness to the immediate present, right? Because in an infinitely material universe, we only ever inherit the now. And the greater the individual's capacity to bring their awareness to this moment, the greater their capacity to redirect it. And I think we've all known people, I'll say, in my personal experience, I've known people who really struggle to bring awareness to their moment and to redirect the trajectory of their lives. Now, much of that is systemic, but there is also an interpersonal aspect of being able to bring awareness to the moment. And there's many practices that an individual can undertake to increase their awareness and develop their powers in that direction. Minimalism is the belief and practice of eliminating the unnecessary. Basically, we live in all of us in this room have grown up in a world of weaponized propaganda. Buy, consume, fit the model, be the thing. And the challenge, of course, is that is a recipe for perpetual dissatisfaction. We want to encourage the individual who most entrenches the value they draw from life in their relationships, in their creations, recognizing that the minimalist can be at home anywhere, and that is the ideal. Enthusiasm is the belief and practice of throwing ourselves into our commitments, right? Of acting with joy. There's a lot of struggles and challenges in the world. I see a lot both in my personal life, in my nonprofit work, but also it's undeniable that there's aspects of the moment. This is the most exciting time ever to be alive. We ride on the crest of the wave of the future, and it is a phenomenally exciting time. What matters most is the direction, though, and that is where we have some obscurity, and that is what temporal naturalism attempts to provide a framework for. And finally, courage. And it's no surprise that courage is in the center. I think a lot of us here at Limicon, if we're doing this work, many of us likely practice courage in our daily lives, but it's fearlessness in the face of the unknown, right? There's so many tremendous unknowns that seem to be compounding weekly. At the same time, we must act. I think oftentimes when it comes to a naturalistic framework of spirituality, we embrace our ignorance. And I write a chapter about being an authentic imposter in the book, but the idea being that we may never know the nature of reality. It may actually be beyond our comprehension given our position in the universe in this moment. But that doesn't absolve us from the responsibility of having to choose a direction. And oftentimes we get caught up in the idea of change being incremental, but all change is incremental, right? We can only do so much with our moments. What matters again most is the direction of how we orient ourselves, the direction that we're collectively focusing on. Because as Dr. Ian McGill-Crest would say, attention is a moral act, right? In the book, I write that any direction of focus and energy is an act of becoming. So it's about kind of orienting ourselves around a shared direction, and these core values are a beginning framework for how we might do that. Moving on to systemic actualization, the second part of self-actualization to most greatly free the individual. Now, I'm going to define a system just so there's no confusion. A system is any creation of ours that governs the relationships between one or more people. And when we think of systems, all systems bear the imprint of their moment of creation in two specific directions. The first is their intended use case, right? What were they intended to do? And if any of you guys have ever built software, I'm a software developer, in my profession, you know that the moment you release software, people use it for things that it was not intended to be used for. So as many of our creations go, the intended use is often perverted almost immediately. But the second component of any system is the values embodied by its creator, which inform the how. Okay, and the how it goes about governing these relationships. A temporal naturalist recognizes that our moral and material interests are inseparable. There is no distinguishing between them. So when we think about the transformation of ourselves and our society, the question has to be, who is most well suited to kind of meet the needs of the moment, and do they have the capacity to do that? In the systemic actualization chapter, I write a lot about self-changing systems. And if self-changing structure are of interest to you, I encourage, again, I'll be speaking again next week about SpiritDAO, and I'll be giving a first look at our community application we've been working on some time. We're very excited, but it's this kind of self-evolving framework for decentralized micro-communities. It's this kind of abandonment of this like maximalist approach to organization, the idea that one ism is better than another ism. I mean, it's economically amateur in that context. Now, what I would make the argument is that if the individual embraces the core values that we previously discussed, really embraces them, like in their heart, it creates a restlessness. And this is not a restlessness to detach from or to ignore. This is a restlessness to embrace. Because ultimately, we have to bind our spiritual orientation to the real world, to the structural world that we inhabit. There's no denying that aspect of reality, especially in the context of who can participate in the imaginative agenda of society. Because today, that is a very limited group of people collectively. But imagine the power we might have as individuals and as a collective when we free that latent imagination through the structures. The Eight Dignities are a suite of public goods, of rights, to unbind our individual rights from the state. One of the biggest challenges with birth lottery is that depending on where you are born, your rights are different. Your access and agency are different. And that has a profound effect on the direction of the individual life. The Eight Dignities, in short, are food and water, housing, healthcare, education, information, communication, transportation, and energy. And I'm not going to dive deep in them today, but if you are interested in research in systemic alternatives, I do suggest you download the book. You can read it online. I've presented a number of alternatives, including legal alternatives, for example, like corporate modules of how we might integrate these things. But the idea is we need to develop a network of public goods without an extractive layer that serve the collective, so that when you are born into society today, for example, today in this moment, if you're born today, we inhabit a world that prioritizes dynastic wealth. That is the wealth of the family, right? So that's the most important thing. We want to demolish that. We want societal wealth. You're born into the most advanced moment in human history, and because of that, and for no other reason than that, you have access to the 8 dignities. And I also want to clarify, because the 8 dignities are not a promise of success. They're also not a promise or an intent of equality of outcomes. In fact, I would argue that equality of outcomes is both unachievable but also undesirable. But what it is a guarantee of is your capacity to participate, your capacity to experiment, to try. Right? I always give the example. In my 20s, I founded a Web 2 company. I was in the home brewing business, and it was like me and a buddy we took 30 grand and we started like a small warehouse shop. And long story short, we ended up scaling pretty wide, and I was there for 8 years before we got acquired. But I always think about, I was 6 years into that business before we were actually making enough to even pay my rent. And if I had failed at year 5, I would have been 30 with no money, no anything. I would have all of that effort, that creative effort, that community service. We taught thousands of people new skills, home skills, brewing beer, wine, etc. But the price of failure today is so high. So it reduces the individual's experimentalist impulse. And part of the reason is it allows those capital holders to have a labor class, right? Because the price of experimentation is so high. And of course, in a systemically actualized society, we would diminish that. So again, ultimately, this is about kind of unbinding our rights from the state. And SpiritDAO, the Church of Temporal Naturalism, this is central to our kind of core efforts. I am not going to be able to go through this comparison. This is a ton of data. I got a little carried away last night. I'm very excited doing kind of a comparative analysis of how does temporal naturalism relate to dynamics of our life, dimensions of our life, compared to monotheistic religions, compared to the timeless reality, and how does it compare? What I will do is on the next slide, I'm going to share a QR code. If you sign up for our newsletter, I'm going to make this like a pretty PDF, and I'll email it out to everyone. So if this is of interest to you, I'll kind of give a comparative analysis. But basically, I will go over 1 or 2 of them before we open it up to Q&A. Let's say, for example, the nature of reality. Ultimately, when we think of monotheism is characterized by God intervenes in history. He comes to a specific people in a specific universe, in a specific area, and he intervenes, and he redeems humanity through supernaturalism, right? Supernatural events. Of course, this poses a question: why at that specific time? Why not earlier, where there could have been a greater consensus? Why not later, where there could have been a greater message spread? Why all concentrated in the specific Fertile Crescent area and not other places in the world where there were civilizations? A lot of questions there. The timeless reality posits that timeless unity is the real thing. So again, this going back to that initial critiques in the very beginning, the more real is the less time bound, which contradicts every observation of nature in the history of the universe. Okay, there's nothing about the history of the universe has not been changing. There's nothing in the history of the universe is static. So we rely on these metaphysical assumptions that are incompatible with a naturalistic worldview grounded in our observations, grounded in our knowledge. The temporal naturalist says reality is dynamic, right? Change and structure are real, they're fundamental. And we see nature on its own terms, with time as the organizing fabric, right? And time being, again, not a product of this physical universe, but rather of the universe itself. Okay, that allows for the idea of sequential universes. And real briefly, I'll move in. So I'm gonna pause here on these, and just a very brief about SpiritDAO. We are gonna do another talk on SpiritDAO next week, because again, we have a community, but just a quick, who we are and what we've done. SpiritDAO is formerly a 501c3 Church of Temporal Naturalism. Now, SpiritDAO, I want to be clear, is not about dogmatically promoting temporal naturalism. In fact, members of SpiritDAO, it is DAO, which means it's a decentralized autonomous organization. Members of SpiritDAO are moving it towards more of an ecosystem approach, where it can be, for example, a more meta-modern spiritual community that all aligns around the 8 dignities. So it's less about you believing what I'm telling you here, and more about collectively orienting us towards a shared direction, that direction being the 8 dignities. So just a kind of brief review. So in 2024, the DAO collectively edited Self-Actualization in the Age of Crisis. We shared space 104 times. We got our church status. We got grants from Google, Canva. We presently are accelerating with the Greater Sum Foundation, which is a philanthropic grant-making design. We began work on our app, which we're going to give a first preview next week. We did a retreat in Vermont. We set up fiscal sponsorship services, and we've, of course, been in the media in a variety of aspects. But I will conclude with this, because I have said a lot, and I appreciate your engagement and your attention and focus. A lot of times when we talk about alternatives, we're met with one of two critiques. We're met with that the alternative is not enough, right? It's too small. It's not going to change anything. Or that the idea is too utopian. It's too big. No way we could do it, right? So the critic sits back and he doesn't have to do anything because they can critique in two ways. What I want to express to you is that change will always be incremental. You and I can only do so much in any individual moment, and that's okay. But the direction of our change is not incremental. That could be a right angle. It could be a 90-degree shift in how we direct ourselves and how we align our efforts. So temporal naturalism and SpiritDAO, the container that we wrap it in, provides a shared framework for an alternative direction to kind of rally our efforts around and from there. So I have said a lot. Let me stop my soapbox. Let me get off. Let's open up for any Q&A. Of course, I am happy to dive deeper into things, and we can kind of go deeper, but I do want to open up shared space. Let me just check the chat real quick. Anything here? And if anyone has any comments or questions, please feel free to interject and share your insights or anything else you might want to, any threads you may want to pull on. Thank you, guys.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning, Jim.
I'm sorry I stepped in a few minutes late. Good morning, everybody. Hi, Victor. Hi, Jen. Hi, Lisa. Hi, Joyce. Mark. Cass. I wanted to suggest, or at least you when you're talking about finding a unified direction, I oftentimes try to suggest that we're trying to move away from ownership into partnership. And I actually use the analogy of being on a ship together, that there are visionaries that climb up on the crow's nest. I kind of use a pirate ship metaphor. And so the person at the helm has to steer the boat, but they have to be in coordination with the visionary, right? And then the captain has to, and so everybody has their parts. People have to raise and lower the sails simultaneously in order for the ship to move effectively. And if I want to get from this point to this point over here, and I have a headwind, right? The natural, elements are moving against me. I have to strategically tack into that direction. So in other words, instead of going from point A to point B, it may be the shortest direction to go straight, but I'm going to have to zigzag my way there. I'm going to have to tack my way across. And so I think that sometimes the tacking, if you're just a passenger on the ship, it's like, hey, how come we're not going from, let's say, I used to sail a lot from San Diego to Catalina Island. Hey, there's Avalon. There's where we want to go. I can see it. Yeah, but why are we going towards Long Beach now? Why do we, it's because we're tacking. We're moving back and forth. And we are going to that direction, but it's not apparent to people that don't understand tacking. It's like when you're climbing up a steep mountain, you have to zigzag your path going up there because a direct approach is just not really feasible. And so I want to suggest that as we develop this partnership concept, that it's important to embrace the idea of a shared direction might not be the most apparent in being direct. And when the boat shifts, when we're going one way and then we're going to turn the sails and move in another direction, I don't know if it's incremental. I think it's a fast boom. The sails all go, and the whole ship goes, and we're going in another direction now. And so I'm not so sure if it's incremental. Sometimes change is immediate. You know, it's like we're going this way, now we're going that way. And if you've ever been on a boat and you have that synchronicity of that's going on, boy, it's dramatic how quickly everything can change. And so I just wanted to kind of suggest that that unifying our direction oftentimes is not apparent, and that we do have to tack sometimes to be most effective with the tools available to us at the moment. So thank you so much for letting me share that. And
appreciate it, Jim. I think the only comment I make, I completely agree. I think we're saying the same thing. The idea that I agree 100% that the direction can be exponential, right? But if this, we're our movement through the, let's say, use your sailing analogy, right? To move through the water is going to be limited to some pace that, you know, will never be as fast enough as we might want it to. I might want to be there already, right? And I still got to go through this water. But to your point about, and the sailing analogy is great because I am not a sailor, so I appreciate the context. But thank you, and thank you for being here.
So I was going to say, thanks, Jim. I kind of, some of my ideas are very, very similar to yours. I think there is like, you talk about tacking. I also think there's like tipping points that happen. So there's like a lot going on with a lot of people. I think everything you've been saying about, I think there's a spirit of the age. Kind of, we feel there's a lot of things emerging that are very, very similar. I think whatever our shared history is, you're using, sorry, I forgot your name. You've just got SpiritDAO there.
Oh, sorry, Ron.
Sorry, Ron, I apologize. So Ron, you're using all the a certain language, you're using certain terms, but I'm seeing a commonality between what you're saying and things have arisen for myself, things that have come from different spaces, different ideas, and I think there's this kind of there's a kind of bubbling up all over the place, and I can't help but feel that these things are going to coalesce sooner or later. There's going to be and actually there may be 20, 30, 40 different kind of maybe religions coming up, but sooner or later we're going to probably have a degree of coalescing, and it doesn't, I'm not sure it matters too much. I'm sure it will coalesce somewhere that's useful. So I think there's a sort of it's not like fate at all, it's actually bubbling up from history and a kind of an emergent recognition of needs and what have you. And I'm not entirely sure there isn't some purpose. I don't mean purpose in a religious sense. I was trying to find it, actually. I don't know if you've read this book. It's Life on the Edge. It's by Professor Jim Al-Khalili and John Jemma. So it's about biology, but they actually look at, there is a section, and I couldn't find it, about how they believe quantum mechanics is pushing evolution along more open ways. So little branches of evolution that wouldn't work, they think collapse, whereas the more useful ones keep going. So it's a kind of little interesting, like quirky thing about perhaps quantum mechanics giving, it's not so much purpose in life, but we go along lines which are more effective and more open and create more life in the universe, more alive. So just, sorry, I couldn't find the quote. I might be able to find it and share it later on.
Jen, I appreciate your insights, and in regards to the purpose component, I think well, first and foremost, I agree 100%. I know it resonated with Jim because he was doing that there's an emergent property to all of this, right? Like it's all of us are here at Limicon. It is, I have been on I spent years kind of doing like tours and speaking lectures, and there's so many people who are kind of delving into similar kind of visions. And I agree with you too that it's likely that there's like I think in the immediate present there's a lot of immediate kind of like directions popping up. But to your point, I feel strongly that there will be a coalescing point, and I think that matters. And I think the big thing, what I'm trying to at least share personally with temporal naturalism, is the necessity of the structural component. If it is purely an internal religious orientation, we're in the same trap we've been in before. And I think the challenge is like, and even like, not to critique anyone personally, right? But there is a movement, for example, for meta-modern Christianity, for example. But one thing I haven't gotten into, but needs saying is that all religions are equally political technologies as they are spiritual technologies, right? They influence relationships in different ways. So long as you have, like, let's say, for example, the Torah, the Quran, or the Bible, at the same time as these books are orientations for meaning and value, they are at the same time a source of declaration of war. They're at the same time about the political oppression of one group over the other. So the challenge with these books as being the future, for example, or being able to be transformed is, so long as the text is sacred, you will have groups of fanatics who leverage the worst part. And let's look no further than the United States. Christian nationalists, theologians, are in charge in the highest levels of government. They are removing rights of women, of people of color, right, of people with various sexual orientations. This is what happens when a political technology under the guise of a religion, guys, so that's the challenge with historical narratives. There's gotta be, so I agree 100%. I'm excited about your comment, and I agree. I know Victor had his hand raised, and then Lisa, and then Jim. I'm gonna bring it back. I got plenty of time, guys, so let's hang. But Victor, please. Victor, you're on mute, buddy.
Okay, how about now?
Yeah, good.
Cool. We've like 5 minutes. The line at I have 5 minutes. So the line of questioning that I was going down was like I'm aware of like the structural component of SpiritDAO and the kind of structure of change that the decentralized community, that kind of thing, and I'm curious about the theory of change, that whether there's a theory of change relationship derived from temporal naturalism that informs the how of SpiritDAO.
The theory of change. So we haven't collectively established like a formal theory of change outside of, for example, like we have a set of values.
Well, so if that's not the case, then the question is like, so what is the relation? What, if any, is the relationship between transcendent naturalism and like the structural component of like SpiritDAO?
Oh, I understand. Yeah. Thank you. So what it boils down to is if we recognize a materially infinite universe, and I recognize you, Victor, as equally possessing of the divinity I have, and that imaginative recursive power, right? My capacity to bring the new into the world. If I genuinely recognize that within you, and I do that within the context of a frame of core values that supports that, right? Then I am driven, I am restless. It is not enough. It is not okay to me that, here's a great example. So I have a 4.5-year-old. I'm a father, right? And I believe that every child is a tongue-tied prophet. And there's no less value of a baby born in Gaza than there is in Africa, than there is in the United States, right? It's this tabula rasa. And I feel an immense restlessness in my embrace of the values and my drive to transform the world towards that structural project. So this is the present orientation. Now that may transform over time of how that connection takes shape. Yeah, please.
Got it. So then in my words, like the relationship that in Ron, right, between transcendent naturalism and SpiritDAO is that transcendent naturalism points to like things that are true in the world that are present in the world, not because they're fundamentally true or need to be that way, but because of some things that are like broken, and that the transcendent naturalism points to like a way things could be, and that means that there can be vehicles towards moving towards a way that things could be. And SpiritDAO affords a specific kind of structure and movement, something that people can participate in, that is a vehicle that is responding to this what transcendent naturalism is pointing at. Like, and I feel like I'm mumbling, like I'm stumbling over the crispness of the articulation, but is that directionally true?
I think we're on the same page. I do want to make it's temporal naturalism because it's based in time and change, right? That's a core component. I think the core orientation that temporal naturalism presents is that nature provides us a context for extremely rich spirituality that recognizes the power and divinity that's latent with us without the need to escape to a supernatural metaphysic, without the need to, because even the timeless one is a political metaphysic designed, for example, a class and caste system where if you were born a coconut farmer 3,000 years ago, you were going to be a coconut farmer your entire life. There was no social mobility. So how do you keep order and structure in a place? Well, the idea is if you're a great coconut farmer, there's a reincarnation cycle. I would make the argument, this is a little off chain, but I would make the argument that reincarnation is actually, in fact, an immoral perspective in today's day, but neither here nor there. The idea being that temporal naturalism provides us a grounding in nature as it is. And from that grounding, a reorientation of who and what we are, and an understanding of how our circumstances shape us, right? And shape us. Because the ideal individual, especially in this moment of emergent AI, is a shapeshifter. The individual who can become what they need to become in that moment. And then when they need to discard it and become something else, they can do that without friction. Today, we inhabit structures that create immense friction to change the direction of our life, whether it be a new job, a new career, a new direction, right? So I think we're on the same page. With SpiritDAO, I will dive deeper into it next week, but we've essentially built a mobile-first scalable community app to support like pod communities that can like put assets on chain, kind of collectively quantify community value, both in time-bound value and monetary value. And we're doing it under a church wrapper, so it gives us the ideal vehicle to do it, speaking candidly. But you're getting me excited about the legalese, so I'll pause.
Well,
but a couple
thank you very
other,
much.
My pleasure, Victor. Thank you. Lisa, you've been so patient. Please.
Hi, thanks so much, Ron. Yeah, I'm so excited. Bye, Jim. Yeah, I just want to say you nailed it. I just appreciate how the obvious amount of time and thought and experience that is compressed into those dignities. And if I go back to some of the things you said in your talk earlier, you know, we can get into the weeds of the nuances of language and different metaphysics and what part of the hyperobject elephant we're touching, but I really think you boiled it down to such a brilliant, if I go back to earlier in your talk, I can see how those dignities are not transcendental truths. They're immanent. I guess you wouldn't even use the word immanent in your lexicon, but they are evolving along with us. So from a deep time perspective, these dignities are sort of the medicines, if you will, the rights and responsibilities that we need at this moment. So I love that idea of like a, you know, it's a provisional snapshot that's very alive, you know, from life. I have been stabbing myself, I can't remember if I already told you, toward a church structure for all those same reasons. And in order to be able to afford the kinds of, you know, liberating choice and ethics from the state and all of that. So I'm going to do whatever I can to cancel what's on my calendar for next week. But if I'm not able to, I'll catch you another time. But just wanted to register, you know, what excites me the most is this, the imaginal, the possibility, how your model handles agency in the now. That I feel like it's exactly what we need. So just kudos and much respect.
I'm humbled, Lisa. Thank you. And I just want to, one comment I'll make to everyone here is SpiritDAO is intentionally a decentralized structure. So what I mean by that is if you're looking for a place to do this, or you're like, oh, we have a church, you can join SpiritDAO, and on day one, you have equal voting power as me. I've given it all away. This is the non-hierarchical organization because I understand that I don't have all of the answers, right? I'm authentic in my imposter. I've done a lot of work in this direction, but I'm also just a dude, right? Like I'm struggling with the same thing many of us are. And so I think collectively, to Jen's point earlier of the emergence component, my hope is that through the vehicle that we're kind of creating, we can kind of coalesce around a space that, because ultimately, like, and this is also, I think, Jim's earlier point, and Jim, I'll come to you next, but it's like, there is an element of scalability that I think is vital to this. Like, I think there's, Limicon is a close space. There's like, a lot of us have seen each other in different places, and it's great because it's growing. But like, I'm concerned, like, for example, why I built the app mobile first that we've been working on is because, like, I want Gen Z. I want, like, the people who are like, I'm an elder millennial, right? Most of us are a little older. Like, it's what about the people who are going to be inheriting the world when we die? Because we're all going to die, right? So it's like, how are we setting them up to kind of have this framework? Hence, like, the design thinking. So again, just deeply appreciate it. I'm humbled. Thank you. Jim, please.
First,
I
housekeeping.
think Jim's before me.
Oh yeah. Okay. Sorry. Go ahead, Jim.
Our names are so close, Jen, that I just kind of assumed it was me. Lisa, I have a housekeeping question for you. The other day when you were speaking in another group, did I hear a monkey talking to you behind you? Are there monkeys in your background?
I am in El Salvador, so it's possible you picked up on some of that ambience, Jim.
Thank you for clarifying. I was like, she's got monkeys. So I just wanted to suggest that that sometimes the words that we're using are I have to really slow down sometimes words because they have so many layers of meanings for me that my mind is having to, like, calculate all of these connections and how they come together. And I just wanted to, one that stuck out with me is, like, when we were being critical of religion, and I saw that in the thread over here. Religion, in the way that I have come to learn that word, is that it comes from the Latin root religio, which is a verb to bind. And so when I think of binding, it can bind us together as a community, but you can also bind a bunch of slaves to do your bidding. And so we're trying to find this, I believe we're trying to find this collaboration where we're providing individualistic autonomy, and yet we also want that autonomy to be unified behind a movement. And so I hope that we find a religio that binds us together in a pro-social and self-autonomous, recognizing and evolving way. And I hope that it doesn't turn into another form of slavery. And so that's the religio that I'm trying to connect with. And I just want to share that for a moment. Thank you.
Appreciate that, Jim.
They had the monkeys for me.
Jim, before you hop on, I just want to recognize Mark, because Mark, you've been chatting. I just want to recognize some of your comments. So yeah, the last comment about the church, you're spot on, by the way. Like, for me, the church organization, it's just the most powerful economic, like, we cannot deny our inheritance of the moment, right? We have to act, but we have to act now within the confines of the world we inherit. So there is no better political and financial vehicle, financial vehicle being the key component, than a church in the US. And especially now, like, if we're being candid with the political economy we have, this is going to be a time, once I do, this is going to be a time, I think, of low regulation, low checking. So this is kind of a moment to beg for forgiveness rather than ask for permission. And I think there's no better vehicle to do it than in a church, if you will. So Jim, please, did you have a quick comment? So I'll let Jeb too. Just
to follow up on that, I don't like showing up to a gunfight with a knife.
Yeah.
And we have tools that are, I'm going to show up with a drone.
Yeah.
And personally, and I'm tired of my people getting their butts kicked. And so I'm actually creating a corporation to take on corporations. I would argue that, because we've had this discussion here at our Eco Village as well, on so we own our land as an LLC, but we're trying to come up with an operations entity. And so we were like, should we be a 501c3 church? Should we be a nonprofit? Should we be a corporation? And I'm kind of leaning towards corporation now because I don't want to be seen as a charity or a cult. And so it also has to do with perception. I want to be seen as an investment. And corporations oftentimes fund nonprofits. If you're a nonprofit or a church, you're depending on patronage. And when you're a corporation, you're depending on investment. And I would like to see us have the ability to choose our investments. And I would like to create an investment that is pro-social, non-scammy, pro-earth, pro-home. And I think that that's possible. The first corporations were about collaboration. There's a reason why corporation and cooperation sound so similar. And so I would argue that we need to approach this problem of the meta crisis not with our hands out like Oliver Twist saying, "Can we please have some of your donations, sir?" And we need to start having cooperative, collective ownership of this world, and we need to buy out the bastards. I'm saying we need to have a seat at the fucking table, man. We need to own the fucking table because we have just as much right to be in this. I always draw the analogy of a squirrel gathering nuts. Imagine if there was a squirrel that convinced all the other squirrels that they had to bring all the nuts to him in order to pay rent to live in the forest. We would go, "That's nuts." And somehow we've been squirreling around with this Monopoly game to where we're all bringing the nuts to the same squirrels, hoping that they'll give us just a little bit of nut juice. And we need to grow up here. So let's start incorporating and kick their asses.
The only I'll make two brief
I'm
comments.
gonna go help out in the bathroom for a second, but I'm gonna listen in.
Okay, yeah, I'll just make two brief comments. The one thing about so just so everyone's aware, right? Nonprofits can generate profit. So like with SpiritDAO, we'll probably, the app we're building, we'll probably spin it up into a separate website that people can subscribe to and like for their own communities. And then that money will support the DAO. The only thing about a nonprofit is you just can't distribute dividends. And the one thing I'll make, and I wish he was here to hear it, but to Jim's point is, I think it is a fallacy to imagine that we can have a seat at the table within the present arrangements. I think you're not going to change the arrangements of the hierarchical capitalistic structure as it exists today in single market maximalism by playing their game. Because the government, the economics, and the law all support like a very rigid hierarchy of who is in control. So it's the same reason like why U.S. democracy is screwed, because with all due respect, it's like U.S. democracy was always intended to favor the rich. That's what the 3/5 compromise, like that, you know, we've had all these minor compromises to recognize our humanity, but the intention of the system was never to do that. It was to protect a very specific class of people. Let me pause. Jen, thank you for being so patient. Please.
No problem. More stuff bubbles up as you talk. So I mean, I think as you have to make pragmatic choices about whatever format we form, and I'm sure some will be churches and businesses. And here in the UK, we have a really good thing called a social enterprise, which is great because you're allowed to decide that the profits are going to be invested in a certain way, and you could only take a certain amount of profit out. So there's all sorts of different ways through. But I'm just thinking about, I mean, to be honest, everything I've heard from you is so incredibly landed for me. I'm not like Lisa with her beautiful enthusiasm and what have you, but I can say it's almost with a faultless landing for me for all the things you've said. And I've often talked to people in religions and what have you, and say, did you actually really choose that religion, or did it choose you? And I think this actually happens here. I feel I'm chosen, to a certain extent. I feel it's like really, really coherent with what you're saying. So suddenly, I'm now suddenly thinking, I have been hanging out at the Stoa, liminal, meta-modern groups for years now. And if I shared what we've been talking here and the vocabulary we've used, even worse on the Stoa, if I did it there, even if I took the 500 closest neighbors in this area, I might get one who would get what we're talking about. And I'm just, for me, this kind of part of my journey is to find the vocabulary, the memes, the way of packaging things for people who've, I'm going to be rude, but their critical thinking is fucked, okay? They're so stressed, they're so traumatized, they're so mal-educated. I'm trying to find ways of bridging to all the regular normal people around me, or even the, I mean, I'm in an eco village and we're surrounded by hippies, but even that kind of thinking is really quite woolly, and they're beautiful people, but you know, they have not got, they're running away. They have not got their act together at all. So, yeah, I'm just kind of thinking, how far have you got with the kind of
yeah. So a couple of things I just want to hit on. I think you hit on a note that I didn't mention in the talk, but I do bring up sometimes, and I really like it, Jen. It's like so I am not part of an intentional community, although my partner and I have discussed it. We do have a little one, so it makes it like very complicated when you have a 4-year-old to kind of like enter one of those. But I do think some of the context, we have to be careful that we're not like entering a veiled escapism, right? Which I think hints to your point, is like we want to retreat from the world. So we're gonna like, oh, we have our community, but like for me, I've done a lot of nonprofit work in the Northeast US with like a lot of Black and brown communities. That's been a lot of like my professional history. So it's like I have a deep connection to these communities and these people. And like, you know, I understand the impacts of being born into the 3rd generation of poverty. I understand what that's like to be at a school, you know, so it's like, Jen, for me, what I find to like the bridge is like the action. It's just doing the work, right? So here's like a full disclosure. SpiritDAO has been official, like SpiritDAO, when the last chapter of Self-Actualization, The Age of Crisis, I wrote about SpiritDAO. So that was 4-year-olds. Appreciate that, Jim. So when I wrote about SpiritDAO, so it was kind of like this concept. Then what happens, we had like a handful of people who kind of got bought into it. And now we're kind of at this influx point, because we had members who were like pretty good for like a year or two, and they've kind of like, you know, life happens. They're doing other things, and I'm still acting. And like we had an infrastructure, but to be candid, the infrastructure was subpar, because we've built our community, like our finances and our voting, our governance is what we call on chain. So it's like this immutable, not hackable record, but the tech for that sucks, or it's been bad in the past. Later, Jim. Thank you so much, buddy. And so I spent the last like 7 months building a mobile app, basically. It's like, how do we get rid of all like the annoying parts and make it like super intuitive? Because that was a big barrier to entry, is like people wanted to participate. What we do well at SpiritDAO is, you know, we're well organized, right? My professional history has primarily been in like executive leadership, building organizations. So I've got a very deep structure component. But what I'm very bad at is promoting. I'm not good at memes. I'm not good at social. We're awful at social media. So like what I'm just trying to find in this immediate present is like people who want to co-own this with the people who are already here. And like, how do we just kind of act? Because ultimately, look, at the end of the day, all of us are here at Limicon. We're doing this work. And like, in many ways, like we are going to fail at our efforts to change the world, right? But in doing so, we're going to change ourselves. So it will be worth it. Right. But from my perspective, there's no alternative but like action. And I think the challenge we have now is like we have like a very limited pool of members. We have like 5 formal members, but only like 2 are active right now. And we have like a periphery of 100. Like people are aware of us. And but I think like with a more committed team, I mean, I am personally, and I don't expect this from anyone, but I'm personally investing, no exaggeration, 30 to 40 hours a week in SpiritDAO. So like, you know, every night I'm doing work, usually during the days, and it's not paid work. Like, don't get me wrong, like this is not like a vehicle where we're there yet. But my hope is that eventually it will be enough to attract people who want to join in that. And then like through that action, like ultimately we have to build an attractor. Right, especially when we think about like to your point, Jen, of like how are we getting people? It has to be something people see and they go like, oh wow, like that resonates, and like, oh, these people are doing it, like I want to do it, like I want to do it, and we can think deep strategy about this. Like let's say, for example, if we wanted to, I'll get real strategic and real like kind of like corporate grimy strategy, but like if we want to, let's say we have a big problem in the United States. Gen Z young males are increasingly conservative, right, and increasingly kind of leaning into like this machismo, false masculinity. So how do we attract them to something like temporal naturalism? We attract Gen Z women, right? This is how we build a community. Like we find ways to kind of like, you know, and like we can play the game from a lot of different varieties, but like ultimately, I don't have the answer, unfortunately, Jim. I can just tell you like what I am doing, which is always focusing on the action. I have non-zero days, right? Like every day I'm doing something to transform the world closer to my vision of the ideal. And it's incremental, it's slow. And I am human. I'll be authentic in my imposter. Sometimes it's frustratingly slow. Sometimes it's painstakingly slow. I spent 3 weeks building a forum and I wanted to throw my laptop across the room. You know, like I just couldn't, I couldn't get, it was terrible, but it's done, you know? And so that's kind of like my thinking is like, what I struggle with a lot in this space, and you mentioned you're part of all the communities, I've been a part of a lot. I feel, speaking candidly, there's a lot of people who want to embody the problem space, but who lack, whether it be the courage or the will or whatever, to stop, say, okay, yeah, things are awful, but what am I going to do right now? What am I going to do right now to transform that? And I think that's like the key bridge is like, can we get that action orientation? And can we make that an attractive way to do it? So, I mean, I don't have answers. I have a laundry list of, yeah, please.
So I don't think you're right. And I think you'll be pleased to be wrong. I think people want to act. I don't think they know how.
Ooh, okay, fair enough. Yeah.
I think there is, and certainly in the liminal community, but I've sensed it over and over again. It's actually, how do we act? How do we organize ourselves? And I think possibly that really is a matter of pragmatic organization. I mean, something like, I'm just going to throw something out, okay? Something like, you read The Art of War together as a group, and then you can, and then there is also, I think on GitHub, there's some really good kind of documentation about how to put into action programs, what have you. So have this little framework, and you have a nice group of people. You say, okay, and if there is I'm just going to pull stuff. I'm sorry. I'm going to just throw stuff at you. There's a way of thinking called boundaryless, and there was a Chinese, I can't remember the guy's name. He owns higher company, but the way they organize their companies, they allow ideas to bubble up, and then they facilitate teams to go ahead and do things. So for example, you know, somebody says, oh, I really think we should act on whatever, maybe we're going to do something about climate change, or empowering women because that's going to make the world better, or looking at maybe Project Drawdown and picking some stuff out of that. And then they get together, they have read The Art of War, they get a little framework, and then off they go. And they start doing that, and then maybe it gathers, maybe it falls over, maybe it dies down, and it, you know, everyone drops back into the pool, and then someone else perhaps. And I think there's kind of having this kind of ecosystem of humans, and I think really something they're trying to do with the liminal web is to have like a dating thing where you match people up who kind of want to do stuff together, and then you find kind of nice. So I think just sometimes it's just really literally getting some organizational principles together, giving people an environment in which they feel empowered, not over leading. You got someone who's too charismatic and too leadershipy. It's kind of, they get all the little followers and they're all sitting there in little seminars, and it's not really functioning. So kind of having this kind of empowering, functioning there's sort of and I love this idea about the unbounded. I mean, it's binding together, but having unbounded people who are just like, they're having their creativity excited, and they're saying, oh, maybe we could do this. And I just really, it just feels really juicy to me. I'm very enthusiastic.
Jen, I just want to say, great critique received. I think you're spot on. I think one thing that I'll just mention, or two quick things. With SpiritDAO, the app, so what we're doing is building like agental AI into the back end of the app. So like when you sign up, you make a profile, we have all these tremendous lists of options you can choose from your areas of interest. And what will happen is the AI will then intentionally connect you with people and say, hey, Lisa, Ron is also interested in like housing equity. Like that happens to be a project I'm working on in my professional life, is like building AI for housing equity in Austin, Texas right now. And it's like, so if you guys want to connect, so like we're trying to like establish that. So I think you're spot on. And I also deeply resonate, you know, one thing I've tried to do with SpiritDAO and the book, as I mentioned, I signed the rights of the book over to SpiritDAO. I haven't made a penny off the book. Like since its inception, the nonprofit's gotten all the money. I think many of the spiritualists in the space, if I may be so critical, are like Prometheus. They steal the fire, but the difference is they want to keep the fire to themselves. So like, look what I got. And they want to be that, the fire bearer, as opposed to spreading the knowledge. And it's like, I've tried through the structure that we've put through to create ultimately my goal. I initially committed to 10 years of SpiritDAO. It's been about 3.5 years. My goal is that in 6.5 years, can I cut the head off the snake? Do we have something that lives? And I can just be like, peace out. Don't listen to me anymore. I'm going to go disappear and just manage my teenage daughter's life. Like I'm out, and that's the idea, because to your point, I don't ever want to be in a position where anyone gives me any higher authority than anyone else, because that's the exact opposite of what temporal naturalism encourages, right? It's just, but it's also like, it's hard to avoid when you're the only one out there like shouting into the clouds, into the void about it. But Lisa, please.
Yeah, I was thinking along similar lines. Ron, you were speaking about the correlation between crisis and opportunity in some kind of way. And Jen, I remember you from the Stoa, and I really relate to this feeling of, I'm working, I'm pouring my heart and soul into this thing, and if we build it, will they come? And I think that's where we are in a moment where temporics are so interesting and anything is possible. Like I retired, I don't think of myself as retired, but I left the New School, a teaching position at the New School just a few years ago for structural reasons. And I don't know if you're working with like Indy Yohar, but some of your work makes me think Dark Matter Labs is his venture, but he's the only other person that I can think of that has laid the infrastructure for they will come. And I think it really is this incredible moment. I see it all around me, the way networks are kind of coalescing. And anyway, I just have I feel a lot of potential in this moment. Was one other thing I was going to say. I don't know if you've looked at Urbit.
I have. Yeah. Urbit I found to be candid a little complicated, and I'm a technologist. So I was like, if it's complicated to me, I'm like a full stack developer by trade. Like if it's complicated to me, like no one is going to be able to figure this out if they like are low tech. So that's why I went the mobile first app route, is like you swipe. Like swiping is like your passkey. Lisa, I love that you worked at the New School. I gave a lecture at the New School last year. I'm close with Ria Alexandra. I don't know if you know Ria. She's part of the
sure. I used to work with her.
Oh, that's wonderful. I'll send her an email saying we connected. Yeah. So that's incredible, and congrats on your retirement. And I am familiar with Dark Matter Labs, though not like connected in any way, shape, or form. Great research lab, and I think to your point, the build it and they will come. It has to be the philosophy, because like what's the alternative? Like do nothing, right? Because they're certainly not coming if we do nothing. So we got to provide some context. And my thinking with SpiritDAO as we launch the app, I'm just braining out with you guys. My thinking is that we'll do it like more virally, where it will be like you invite someone into it. So it's like you can get to the app if someone invites you. So it's like a kind of a naturally expanding network, because one of the big things about DAOs, right? So the way, I don't want to get too ahead of myself because I'm going to talk about this in detail next week, but like our financial structure, we use two currencies. We use a time-bound currency, and then we use a fiat linked currency that's tied to the nonprofit's bank account. So like our total dollars that we collectively work with are tied to actually what's the capital we have in our bank account. And we take into account obviously our operational fees, because there's monthly, we have digital services we pay for, Google, etc. But the hope is that like through like this organic way, it's vital that we have like a proof of humanity, that we know we're dealing with people who are genuine and people, right? Because we cannot delude ourselves. AI agents are like a few months away. Like let's be like real AI agents where like we're talking to them on camera, and you and I have a difficulty understanding if they're real or not. So the viral component of like, oh, I'm part of this community and I'm going to give you a passcode to invite you in. That way it grows organically, and we don't have like a flood of 1,000 people no one's ever met before. Like, how do we possibly verify that they're human? That's going to be a struggle I'm trying to like kind of conceptualize. So it's just like one thinking out loud of like how we might organize it. To my knowledge, dark matter, I've read some of their papers and it's really insightful stuff, but it's really high level. You know, it's like, oh, this is like the high level, and it's more of a direction as opposed to an action oriented, you know,
Right.
collab.
You know, I'm just remembering the other point I wanted to bring in, which was, you know, the new school. I worked at several universities, but as I'm sure you're well aware, the universities are, you know, so encumbered by various forms of capture. And, you know, I don't think it's the moment, you know, in this moment of the dissolution of modern forms of institution, that's why I think they'll come. So I'm looping back to Jen's point about youth and Black and brown folks and others who have been disenfranchised for so long. So I think when we come back to leveling the playing field and finding those structural ways of actually impacting the structural logics, things like you're doing, it's what we need. So kudos.
My pleasure, everyone. And I think this is a good stopping point. I've genuinely enjoyed this. I appreciate all of you so much. I have shared a couple of just links. There's SpiritDAO, the website's got our socials. Our Telegram is the most active social channel right now. I don't know if you guys are on that, but it's just like a chat. And you know, our Discord's not that great, but again, my hope is in a couple of weeks we'll be launching this app live, maybe even by next week. I was like prepping for this talk, so I'm going to go on like a sprint to finish the app before I talk next week. But that will be like a closed system for us. But you know, again, I highly encourage you, if this is of interest, please let me know how I can empower you to kind of, you know, whether it be within SpiritDAO or alternatively, I've always been open about this. What we're building, to Jen's earlier point with the emergent movement, we're happy to open source it as well. Like we're kind of on the fence, like do we want to make it not open source because we can, you know, generate capital for the nonprofit? But alternatively, if you really have your own community, you just want the infrastructure, just let me know. You know, like I don't need to be the hero. It's more about like, again, that collective shared direction that we're all like aligned with. So I just deeply appreciate you guys. Thank you so much for tuning in. It's been a privilege and an honor. Yeah, Jen.
So where can we reach out to you? SpiritDAO community or email? What's your favorite?
SpiritDAO community is the best. If you do, I'll just give you my personal email if you want to ever, if that's worked for you. I'm in the Telegram nonstop. That's my personal email. The Telegram is the most active like social thing we have, but we have all of our like social links on our website. So again, the hope is that like the newsletter is good. If you haven't already, if you sign up for the newsletter, which is a link above, that'll be like the first announcement of like, hey, the app is live. Like let's do, and what we're gonna do is like a kickoff meeting. So my hope is get like all the old members, anyone who's new interested in like, all right, we're gonna actually make it DAO now. Like we're gonna say, hey, you know, I'll be an executive pod, you be a dev pod, you be a message pod. Like we'll kind of collectively work this, and we'll give ourselves accountability and infrastructure to kind of make it move and just do the best that we can. I think it's been a long time coming and it's been a lot of friction, but I think I want to believe that we finally kind of cracked the nut of like, oh, this is going to be super accessible, while at the same time providing the depth of security and transparency we want around like decentralized finances and assets. Because SpiritDAO, the intention is to acquire assets, of course, in the future and like have those shared within the community. So yeah, it has been wonderful. Thank you all so much. I hope you have a wonderful day, and hopefully I'll see you next week. Thank you guys.